You offered to help.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to this meeting for Sunday, November 12th. If we could all just please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Grigsby,
Here.
Mrs. McCarthy,
Yep.
Mrs. Saxon,
Yes.
Mrs. Tamira,
Yeah.
Mr. Vaca.
Here. Finalization of the agendas. Anything to add or remove?
The agenda is final as presented.
Thank you. It is recommended that the Board of Education approve the written summary of the regular minutes for the meetings on October 2nd, 2023 and October 17th, 2022.
No, second.
Moved by Ms. Tamira, second by Ms. Saxon. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Tamira,
Yes.
Mrs. Saxon.
Yes.
Mr. Grigsby.
Yes.
Mrs. McCarthy.
Yep.
Mr. Vaca.
Yes. All right, we'll move right into the superintendent treasurer's report.
Thank you, President Vaca, Superintendent Casario, members of the board. Happy to present to you the five-year forecast for November 2023.
Maybe.
Well, here we go, I'll take it for you then, sorry about that, I'm just putting this on.
All right, so the five-year forecast, it is a requirement, under Ohio Revised Code. It is required 2 times per year. We do our initial in November, and then we have an update, in May. The last one we approved was May of 2023. And now, this will be our initial five-year forecast for the current fiscal year 24. Format is 3 years of historical actual data. So 21, 22, 23, and then 5 years of projected data. And we are looking at the general fund only, the operating fund, which is our main fund that we use to operate the district. So we have actual revenue, like I said, up through 23, and then projected revenue and expenditures from fiscal year 24 through 28. The forecast is a very important tool we use to assess the overall financial health of the district. We use it as a communication tool to engage the board, the community and long-range planning, and a tool in our decision-making process. It is the basis for the approval of contracts and negotiated agreements. And it is a method for our outside stakeholders, oversight organizations like the Auditor of State's Office, Ohio Department of Education, to identify school districts that may have potential financial issues. The five-year forecast, if you don't mind.
Okay.
It is not an exact depiction of future events. There are many other things that impact the forecast. I mean, information changes a lot, so the forecast can change a lot. It's based on several assumptions of the snapshot in time. Ongoing recovery from COVID-19. I mean, there are still things that are coming up that we're discovering and the impact that COVID had. So there are still, items that could fall within there. Enrollment trends, of course, federal funding, especially ESSER, and mostly legislation, current and future proposed legislation dealing with state budget or fair school funding plan, real estate, market conditions, valuations, any type of legislation can also, of course, impact the five-year forecast. So for the current fiscal year, we have a total projected general fund revenue of $53,195,000. Total projected general fund expenditures of $54,231,000. for a projected deficit of $1,035,000. Now, there are several factors that are contributing to that deficit. One of the main ones is the expenditures that we had previously offset to the ESSER using those ESSER funds are now being returned to the general fund. If you remember, we took the approach to offset existing expenditures in personnel, line and personnel costs, specifically salaries. And that really helped the district's long-term financial outlook by taking that approach and doing it that way. But now that we have utilized all of that funding, those expenses will now return to the general fund in the current fiscal year. We also have increased capital outlay expenditures to address the need for additional space at the elementary level. Even with that, the bond issue passing now, there still will be a certain portion of the district cash balance that will be needed to make current building configurations suitable for the elementary level, the growing need there. So additional capital outlay expenditures have been modeled under capital outlay for the projected years. Those will span over multiple fiscal years, and those projects will first be addressed at Liberty, and then potentially at ECLC about in the mid to the later years on the 5-year forecast. But I just wanted to point that out. The forecast does assume some kind of ongoing investment there. And then you can see, of course, the corresponding cash balance, the impact of the cash balance based on the deficit that we're showing, starting with the beginning cash balance of $27,491,000, and then being taken down to the $26,456,000 for projected ending cash balance for the current fiscal year. So real estate stands as the district's primary revenue source at 61% of total projected revenue. That is both class 1 residential and class 2 commercial industrial, as well as public utility. State funding makes up the majority of the remaining portion at 33%. That's funding derived from the unfair school funding plan. Restricted state aid is also part of that formula, as well as state share of local taxes. Now, that's a new title for this year. That was formerly known as property tax allocation, or our homestead and rollback. That is now called state share of local taxes. And that funding is kind of tied to like what our real estate is doing, but it's coming from the state in the form of credits or reductions, including a 10% rollback credit, 2.5% owner occupied credit, and homestead credit for eligible taxpayers. The state did away with that after 2015. So we get this on our operating millage that was passed before that time, including the substitute levy. Even though that was passed in 2019, that's a point I really want to make. It's important that we keep that in place so that we continue to get that portion of money from the state, because it is connected to our real estate. So, you know, as values grow, as real estate grows, that portion that the state kicks in grows along with it. It follows that same trend. So with real estate being such a significant piece of our revenue, I mean, there's no question that there's a direct correlation with our total operating revenue. Our forecast anticipates substantial growth in this area of real estate. This is expected from countywide reappraisals that are going to take place through the forecast period, as well as several new construction projects that are going to be completed over the next few years. And this growth will extend to line items on our forecast in real estate, public utility, and that state share of local taxes, like I just mentioned. It is important too, I'd like to mention that future legislation may have an impact on this, and we've seen you know, little glimpses of this, like with House Bill 187 most recently being proposed. It could very well impact, you know, the timing of collection, or even cap the overall growth of assessed property values. So far, you know, nothing has really come of it, but it's something that I'm definitely keeping an eye on, and it's something that could impact, the 5-year forecast for us. State funding remains steady, consistent, no significant changes projected here, because we are on the guarantee. We're heavily on the guarantee. The district relies on that to maintain funding levels consistent with the 2021 period. For North Ridgeville, the total per pupil base cost is set at $8,127. Out of this total, the state contributes $1,558 per pupil, while the local portion amounts to $6,569 per pupil.
Can you please repeat that again?
Yeah.
The per pupil base cost is set at $8,127. Out of that total, the state contributes $1,558 per pupil, while the local portion amounts to $6,569 per pupil. Now, without being on the guarantee that I just mentioned, we would actually receive less state funding than we did in 2021 if we were to be funded strictly on the calculated formula ratio. But we're on the guarantee to at least keep our funding the same, but this is how the formula is calculating that per pupil ratio. And you know, property values and taxpayer incomes are the significant variables impacting that calculation. That is what determines mainly the district's local share of state funding. Property values have the most weight at 60% in calculating that per pupil local wealth capacity. And then taxpayer income determines the balance of that.
Can you remind me the name of the funding formula again? Fair funding?
Yeah.
Okay.
The unfair school. You go to the next slide. Thank you. So the district's most significant category of expenditure is personnel costs, being made up of salaries and benefits at 80%, which is typical for most school districts. I'd say that's even on the lower side from what I've seen. In fiscal year 24, there is a noticeable increase in personnel expenditures as they transition from being offset by ESSER back to the general fund. But another reason for these increases throughout the forecast period is rising healthcare costs. So the district is in an insurance consortium, Suburban Health Consortium, with several other school districts. And consortium-wide, we have seen a 13% increase in insurance premiums. And that is beginning in the current fiscal year that we're in. And that was the first time in several years that we've seen an increase that high. So I have taken a blended rate of worst case scenario for us throughout the projected years until I have additional information to go on with that. Second to personnel is purchase services there. This is for items like utilities and services to keep the district running and operating. But 50% of that cost goes towards meeting the needs of students on individualized education plans. You know, whether that's placement, facilities or transportation that's involved there as well. So in terms of sustainability for the projected years, there are fluctuations in both surplus and deficit situations that we're seeing here, but overall stability is maintained from an operational standpoint. It's interesting. You have these competing revenues and expenses where one or the other is prevailing depending on the fiscal year that you're looking at. Where that projected deficit in the current fiscal year then turns to a surplus halfway through the forecast period for a net gain of $624,000 in fiscal year 26. And then again, in fiscal year 28. And so charted out, you get this somewhat flat line illustration, that yellow line representing the cash balance, which is relatively stable throughout. And those notable increases in real estate are going to have a substantial impact on this, like as I covered before. And due to the timing of revenue collection and our periodic expenditures that we have in different system years, our rotational expenditures in the areas of curriculum, technology, capital outlay. You're seeing both that surplus and deficit kind of being trickled throughout the forecast, depending on the fiscal year. So you have deficit, surplus, deficit, and then a surplus with overall stability being maintained. We are still trending a little higher on annual average expenditure change at 5.29% compared to the projected revenue at 4.36%. I do create this in a conservative manner, so I think it is possible we can balance that out by that time, balance our budget out by that time. I'm hopeful that we can do that. But finally, one of the main things I'd like to point out, and I feel like I always point this out, but as a district, we want to be in a good financial position. We would always like to maintain at least 3 months worth of expenditures as cash balance at all times. And this forecast keeps us exceeding that area. So it just helps put us in a better position if something were to happen to our tax base or state funding. It just gives us that time to think and readjust so we can make the best decision possible instead of, doing something in an emergency manner. But overall, I am pleased. This information, like I said, is always subject to change. Hopefully there is nothing on the legislative front that would impact our tax base or state funding, which would be my main concerns. But I'm excited about bringing this type of information to the board and to the community. And with that, it concludes my forecast report. This report will be available in its entirety on the district's website, the treasurer's office page. But I'd be happy to answer any questions the board may have.
So the need for new revenue has been pushed out quite a ways at this point, based on these projections. So that's exciting for the community,
Yeah.
especially after we pass on a bond issue and concerned about when we would be coming back. So there would be no need for that in the near future whatsoever, short of Columbus doing Columbus.
Yeah, I wouldn't say whatsoever, but
I mean, really, they're the wild card, right? Columbus would be the biggest thing.
state funding and if there's gonna be legislation proposed that's gonna change how we may collect our real estate revenues, like whether it's the timing or we only get a certain percentage of that. Yeah, but other than that, I mean, it looks good. Right. I think if we can, maintain and be smart, make good decisions and control our costs, I think, we'll be in good shape.
Questions were very informative and explained it
Yes,
really well.
well,
That concludes the superintendent treasurer.
awesome, thank you. All right, so I'm not gonna forget, there's an opportunity for a hearing of the public, which clearly nobody's in attendance today. Is there any announcements?
Should probably thank our community.
Absolutely.
Raise my water glass.
Thank you.
All of our supporters in North Dakota.
Thank you so much. Exciting, the idea of building a new high school, so thank you. All right.
Electing. Yes, congratulations.
Yes, thank you to the community for that as well, for trusting me with another 4 years. We're moving to the consent agenda. It is recommended that the Board of Education approves the consent agenda resolution as presented.
Okay.
Moved by Mr. Mara, second by Mr. McCarthy. Roll call, or is there any discussion? Roll call, please.
I'm sorry, who was first and second?
Mira McCarthy.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Tamira,
Yes.
Mrs. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. Grigsby,
Yes.
Mrs. Saxon,
Yes.
and Mr. Baca.
Yes. Finance audit report, Ms. McCarthy.
Thank you. We have a resolution to approve the financial reports for the month of October 2023. We also have a resolution to approve the November 2023 5-year forecast as just presented by Mr. Pacini. I move to approve the finance audit items in one read. Second.
Moved by Ms. McCarthy, second by Ms. Tamira. Okay. Roll call, please.
Mrs. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mrs. Tamira, Mr. Grigsby.
Yes.
Mrs. Saxon,
Yes.
Mr. Vaca.
Yes. All right. It is recommended that the Board of Education approve the bid of one modular classroom complex from EMOD Construction Company consisting of 8 classrooms and restrooms. I move to approve the buildings and operations report in one reading.
Frank, yeah.
Any discussion?
This is just for the purchase of the
Unit.
the
themselves.
units
Yeah.
themselves, and so there's gonna be additional costs set forth for utilities and foundation work and all of the fun stuff that
Yes.
goes along with.
Equipment, furnishing, yes,
Okay.
And again, this is to address the need at Liberty
that's correct.
Elementary.
That is correct.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Vaca,
Yes.
Mr. Grigsby,
Yes.
Mrs. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mrs. Saxon,
Yes.
Mrs. Tamira.
Yes.
Moving to the human resources report, Ms. Saxon.
We have a few items to consider under the human resources report. One, support staff appointments, 2, non-NREA supplemental contracts. I move to approve the human resources items in one reading. Second.
Moved by Ms. Saxon, seconded by Ms. Tamira. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Saxon,
Yes.
Mrs. Tamira,
Yes.
Mr. Grigsby,
Yes.
Mrs. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. Vaca.
Yes. Recommended that the Board of Education adjourn this regular meeting. Moved by Ms. Tamira, seconded by Ms. Saxon. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Tamira, Mrs. Saxon,
Yes.
Mr. Grigsby,
Yes.
Mrs. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. Vaca.
Yes.
11:53.
Thank you, everybody.
Right on time.
Yep, that's good.